Well, hello everyone and welcome to Ignite of Praise. I'm very much missing seeing all of your faces at church, but it's been great to see some of the things that you've been getting up to at home. So thank you to those of you who have sent in pictures of some of the things that you've been doing and some of the crafts that you've been up to at home in response to Ignite of Praise, or maybe our new series, Niall to Nebo. Well, today we're going to be thinking about the word grace. You've probably heard the word grace being used at some point, and maybe you've heard it in this song.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.
What a great tune that it is. Thank you so much, Joe. Or maybe you've heard it in this song.
Grace, 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 paid for my sins, brought me to life.
Thanks so much for that, Joe. Again, also a great song. But more seriously now, maybe you've heard the word grace being used at dinner time. You might say grace. Or maybe you've heard the word being used at church. But what does the word grace actually mean? What is grace? Well, hopefully we're going to figure out the answer to that question now and figure out what grace actually means. But first we're going to play a quick game of what would happen if. Well, in this game I'm going to give you a scenario and you will have to match it with its likely outcome, which will be on the screen. Let me give you an example. So I might say to you, what would happen if you cheated in a game? And then you would have to point to the screen to the most likely outcome or consequence of that. So you might point to something that says you get banned from playing. Hopefully that makes sense. So I'm going to put lots of outcomes on the screen and then I will give you lots of scenarios and you have to point to the one that you think is the most likely outcome for those scenarios. So let's play. Here on the screen are the possible outcomes. What would happen if you were rude to a teacher? What would happen if you stole something from a shop? What would happen if you lied to your parents? What would happen if you called a friend mean names? What would happen if you cheated in a sports race? What would happen if you disobeyed your parents? Well, I wonder what outcomes you pointed to as I read out those scenarios. Well, here are some of the possible matchups. But you might be wondering, what has any of this got to do with grace? Well, all of these things are wrong in some way, aren't they? And it is right that they would deserve some form of punishment. If you were rude to a teacher, you would deserve some form of punishment, like being kept in at lunchtime. If you stole something from a shop, you would deserve some form of punishment, like being arrested by the police. If you cheated in a sports race, you deserve to be disqualified. Well, when we do something wrong, a punishment is deserved, isn't it? But imagine if all of the outcomes that we just saw were changed to these following outcomes. What would happen if you were rude to a teacher at school? Your teacher says, "It's okay," and gives you a reward. You stole something from a shop, and the shop owner lets you off and lets you take away what you stole for free. You lied to your parents. Your parents decide to forget about it and take you to the cinema as a treat. You call a friend mean names, and your friend forgives you and continues to be your friend. You cheated in a sports race, and you're allowed to keep your finishing position of first place. You disobey your parents, and your parents let you stay up later than usual and and let you have a sleepover. Well, these new outcomes would be amazing, wouldn't they? If you were rude to your teacher at school, it would be amazing if your teacher said, "It's okay," and they also gave you a reward. And all of the other ones are amazing too as well, aren't they? But what is it that makes them so amazing? Well, it is grace. You see, none of these new outcomes would be deserved, would they? You wouldn't deserve to keep your position of first place if you cheated in a sports race. And you wouldn't deserve to be let off and to keep something that you stole for free if you stole it. That is why these new outcomes would be so amazing, because none of them are deserved. And that is exactly what grace is. Grace is when you're given something good that you didn't earn or deserve. Grace is when you get a blessing that you didn't earn or deserve. And in the Bible, we see the best ever example of grace. We see the best ever example of being given something good that isn't earned and isn't deserved. And Adam is going to tell us more about that now.
Well, the best story of grace in history is one that includes me and you too. But I wanted to tell a smaller story of grace first, because it's hard to get my head around the whole picture all at once. Now, this is one of the stories that Luke wrote down about Jesus in his Gospel. You might be able to work out which one it is. It's about Jesus and a man that he meets. This man's quite important because he was a tax collector. He wasn't very popular in Jericho, maybe that's also because he was a tax collector. He was also quite short, have you guessed? It's Zacchaeus, who runs ahead of the crowd and climbs a tree to see Jesus. Can you imagine how exciting Jesus must have been in Jericho for people to react like that? Has a banker or an accountant ever run out of their office in the high street in their suit and their really smart shoes and climbed up a tree in the street just to get a look at you? It's definitely never happened to me. Now, I think there are two halves to this story. In one half, Zacchaeus says to Jesus, "Look, I'm giving away half of all my money and my things to the poor right now. I'm even paying back everyone I've ever shortchanged. I'm paying them back 4 times as much, Jesus, look." And in the other half of the story, Jesus says, "Zacchaeus, I want to stay at your house. I want us to be friends." Well, the really surprising thing about this story, I think, is that it doesn't happen that way around. We imagine sometimes that Jesus becomes friends with people because they're doing good things, but that's a mistake. Jesus doesn't become Zacchaeus' friend because he's seen Zacchaeus give money to the poor. No, Jesus becomes Zacchaeus' friend first, before he's done anything good. Jesus offers Zacchaeus friendship for no reason except how good Jesus is. That's grace. Grace is a gift without any reason for giving it, except for the goodness of the person who gives, which is Jesus in this case. Now, if you think about the game that you played before, if we did any of those things and were shown grace instead of the punishment we deserve, well, that would be amazing, wouldn't it? But it wouldn't mean that the wrong thing that we did doesn't matter. Being rude to people, or stealing, or lying, or cheating, and the rest, they all do matter, and they matter a lot. The Bible tells us that the consequences for doing wrong things, for our sin, are very, very serious. And it also tells us that sin can't just be ignored. And that's because God is so holy that he can't ignore sin. After all, if somebody had stolen from you, or lied to you, or upset you, and God was happy to ignore it, well, that would be no good at all, would it? Our God doesn't ignore anything in his creation that should be sorted out. So grace, being given something good that we didn't earn or deserve, isn't saying that wrong doesn't matter. But actually God's grace is like this. It is God saying people's sin matters a lot, but God says, I will take on all the consequences for you. And that is what Jesus did, which brings us to our best ever example of grace. Just like Jesus called Zacchaeus to join him, he called you and me too, even though we haven't done anything interesting or exciting or especially praiseworthy to make Jesus want us on his side. In fact, just like Zacchaeus, we weren't really on Jesus' side to start with at all. We'd all started off on our own side, not interested in Jesus, shoving him out of the way to put ourselves in charge. And that, of course, is what the Bible calls sin, when we shove Jesus out of his place as the rightful king of our lives. We'd all done this, even if to our friends we're quite nice people, really. We'd ignored the proper king, and that's a problem that needs huge solutions. But Jesus was never going to let the story end there. He rescues us from all the trouble that we've made for ourselves, taking the rightful punishment for it instead of us. And then on top of that, he calls us to join him, to be on his side, to become a friend of the rightful king of all creation, and follow him. Just like with Zacchaeus, this isn't because of anything that we'd done. It's just grace to us from Jesus. Well, there are a huge number of stories of grace like Zacchaeus that show us how amazing Jesus' ultimate grace is. But we don't have time to tell them all now. Instead, Paul explains grace like this.
Hello, Igniters. I'm going to be reading Ephesians chapter 2 and verses 8 and 9. For it is by grace you have been saved, through faith. And this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast.
Well, that wasn't Paul, it was Ed, of course, but those words are from Paul's letter to the church in Ephesus, and they explain that the amazing rescue and resurrection plan that God has made for you doesn't depend on anything that you've done. This plan isn't from yourselves, it isn't made of any works that you can do. There's nothing that you or I can boast about. We haven't done anything to make it happen. We're saved by Jesus alone. And the reason for Jesus to save us is always only his grace.
But Adam, if grace is so good and if we can't fix things ourselves, then why do we bother with rules?
That's a great question, Heather. And these aren't just rules that are made up by any old grown-up to make their lives easier. These rules come from the real man in charge. And why is he in charge? Well, because he built the whole world. Everything works just how he designed it, and there isn't a single piece that he doesn't understand. So, of course, if he's writing an instruction book, well, it's one that I'd quite like to read. If the whole world works just how he designed it, including me, then his instruction book is probably a pretty good one, even if sometimes I can't understand why. We can all see that some boring rules exist for our safety, like no running in the corridors. We know that although running in corridors is actually great fun, every now and then somebody ends up bumping their head, and so the rule really is quite good. And so that's why, even though these rules aren't what get us anywhere, these rules aren't the things that fix things, they're still probably quite good.
Adam, but even if rules really are quite good, if there aren't any consequences, well, does it really matter if we keep them or not?
That's another great question, Heather. Even if the rules are quite good, really, if there aren't any consequences, does it matter? Well, often the real reason that we follow rules is to avoid the consequences that we'll get for breaking them. But that isn't the only consequence. Take tucking your shirt in at school, for example. Now you might think that's a totally pointless thing to do. After all, it's just your shirt, why should it be tucked in, who cares? But you probably tuck it in anyway. And that's not just because you might get detention if you don't. What other effect is it going to have? If your teacher asks you to do something and you don't do it, or you do it, that's going to affect your relationship with that teacher. If your parent asks you to do something and you ignore it, well, that's going to affect your relationship with your parent. And similarly, if they ask you to do something and you do it well and graciously, well, that's going to really boost your relationship with that person. So it's not always about the consequences. Sometimes these rules are, firstly, for our good and really helpful in our lives, and secondly, well, they really help our relationship with a person. It's not just about getting into trouble, it's about how we interact with God.
Well, today we've seen the best ever example of grace. We've seen how God had grace on us through Jesus. And because of that, we should have grace on others. And it says that in the Bible. In Ephesians chapter 4 verse 32, it says, "Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you." Well, why don't you just spend a moment now to press pause and speak to some of the other members of your household and ask this question. Who are some people that you can show grace to this week? And also, how does what we've learnt today and seen of the best ever example of grace motivate you to show grace to other people? Well, before we end our time together, I just wanted to say that I'm no longer going to be staying in Nottingham because I'm getting married soon and I'm going to be moving to Derby, and that means that I'm going to be moving church, so I won't be at Cornerstone anymore, so I won't feature in any more Ignite a Praise videos, but I've absolutely loved being at Cornerstone and I've loved getting to know you.
Let me pray. Father, thank you for your amazing grace to us. Thank you for Jesus, who came to show us who you are, to die for our sins, and to invite us to follow you. Father, I pray that you would help us to follow you, to show grace like you do, and to have peace in knowing that your rescue plan for us doesn't depend on what we can do, but on what you've done for us. Thank you for your grace. Amen. Now let's respond to that grace by singing All About Jesus.